Something's going on. I don't know what to do.
Are you drunk or something?
Drunk's more fun. Can I be serious with you for a minute?
I don't know, can you?
Yes, I'm being serious. I'm having a problem. I may be having a problem. Rita.
It's Groundhog time.
See? I knew you were going to say that. I really feel weird.
Let's just do this, Phil. Then we'll talk.
All right, on me in 3, 2, 1. Well, it's Groundhog Day. Again?
And the deep state is running a coup in Eastern Europe. Again.
Where have I heard this before? So familiar. I feel like it's a deja vu moment.
It is. It's a crazy story. Romania's elections have been canceled and then restarted. And then when the guy who won it last time filed, they said, you can't run because reasons. We'll be diving into it.
Thank you so much for joining us, everybody. This is another episode of Human Reaction. We are so glad to have you here. Please, before we get started, if you're on YouTube, go ahead and smash the like button and subscribe. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss an episode. If you're on Spotify or Apple or any other podcast platform, please take a quick second, leave us a review. It really means a lot for us in terms of getting the show out to more people and helping to grow this thing. This episode is brought to you by Revved Up Promo, the official apparel partner of Human Reaction. Revved Up is a premier full-service shop specializing in laser engraving, screen printing, and embroidery. Not only are they now making all of our apparel right down the road from us, they can do the same for your brand and ship it to you anywhere in the world. Revved Up helps you navigate the extensive universe of merch options and uses state-of-the-art techniques to showcase your brand in its very best light. So if you want to support our show and our generous sponsor, you can now do so by buying our merch and by turning to Revved Up Promo for your own custom apparel needs. Reach them at revveduppromo.com. That's with 2 V's and 2 P's, or just check the show notes for a link.
Well, the Viktor Orban, I think that's the right figure to compare him to. You could say the Trump of Romania. The Viktor Orban's more correct, I think. When you look at his overall position.
Prime Minister of Hungary. Right.
He was the news from this week, and that we're reacting to more directly, was forbidden from running after having his election canceled. So we'll start from the very beginning, right?
Okay. So this guy's name is Călin Georgescu.
Yes.
And people would have heard of him before, going back all the way to late November when the election was first held, right?
Yep.
The first round, they have multiple rounds of voting. He came out the victor with, just over 22, almost 23% of the vote.
Correct.
In what seemed to be a surprise to the sort of the political establishment in Romania. Is that correct?
Yeah, right. And the big part of that was the TikTok campaign. You know, he went around the legacy media in a lot of ways. He's not a young person, right? I mean, he's older. He's a boomer age, and he was just a shock election that just put everyone on their heels. Soon after that, though, the Constitutional Court validates the first round results after a recount, a 9 million vote recount. Confirming that that Georgescu, that confirmed that he won and orders the runoff. So kind of think of it like jungle primaries or a jungle system. They have this in Atlanta or Georgia. Yeah, it's funny because his name's Georgescu, but in the state of Georgia, if there's 3 candidates on the general election ballot and they don't get enough to get to 51%. There is a runoff that then happens from November to December.
Gotcha. Sort of like ranked choice voting, in a sense?
No. Ranked choice voting is with a single ballot. So, yes, ranked choice voting kind of models that with a single ballot, but how this works is there's another election and they run for another month. This one's a lot shorter. It's only a 2-week election at that point, and then people can vote on the final 2.
Gotcha. So they go into the second round, and what happens?
Well, the current president, whose last name is Klaus Ioannis, he releases a partially declassified intelligence file alleging Russian interference. So he cites 25,000 pro-Georgescu TikTok accounts. He also says some stuff about cyber attacks and illegal campaign funding. Now, Georgescu says, I've spent $0 on my campaign. I've provided all the documentation, but no one looks at it. They just claim that I had this campaign money, but they won't, no specifics, and not independently verified by anybody else. This is very similar to, what does it evoke for you when you hear that? What is it? What is that? What comes up in the American mind?
I get real Hunter Biden laptop vibes.
Yeah, right?
With the, 51 intelligence operatives signing the letter saying, this is absolutely Russian disinformation. Seems very much an analog here in Romania with them saying, there's no way this guy could have won authentically. There's no way the popular support is there for him. This is all a Russian op.
Right.
And we can't trust it, and we have to throw out the results.
It can't be true that the people of Romania would ever like this guy, right? He believes all the wrong things. For example, he believes that COVID isn't real.
Well, that's something.
right. And it's not like he's a dummy. His background is he was in like renewable agriculture and sustainability development.
That sounds perfectly, establishment.
He was a very Maha-like figure, though, in that space, right? Everybody's saying, the standard practices are all wrong. We need to preserve our forests and a more natural way of life and carbon balance, and we need sustainable agriculture that lives in harmony with the land, right? He's a very like Maha figure. I think it would be the closest American analog.
Sure, but at the same time, he's not the globalist strain of that.
Yes,
right. Not saying we need this top-down government. He believes in Romania. He doesn't believe in the EU. He wants sovereignty and independence and all of those things. So he's sort of the MAGA of Romania.
Yeah, right? Yeah. That might be what to say. I mean, MAGA, or he's just an Orban-like figure, right? He's a nationalist in the non-Nazi phraseology of that term, right? So, and I want to make a point on this evidence too. Even the Atlantic Council, with 7 members of the board are all former CIA directors. The Atlantic Council, the think tank of NATO, the Atlantic Council, the worst actor, probably one of the worst actors in stirring for the war in Ukraine. And this guy's a Ukraine war skeptic, right? He's like, we shouldn't be providing weapons to Ukraine and encouraging this fight. Even the Atlantic Council noted the evidence was circumstantial and unconclusive. And Russia denies involvement, of course, right? So even if it was an op of some kind, this feels very much 2016-ish, right? Where they're like, but they tried, and that's all we need to know is that they tried to influence the election. But then imagine that your court said, therefore the election is now canceled.
Right.
Not going to happen.
Yeah. So, and there were also protests that broke out around this time, right?
Yeah. So this is the pro-European protest breakout in Bucharest, which is somewhere around between 5,000 and 10,000 people. And I tried to get more accurate numbers on the protests we're going to mention, and I just want to just for some reason, I think like getting Google Translate to translate Romanian is harder than other languages. I don't understand why. Brave just wouldn't detect when there was Romanian there, right? So, but this is largely anti-Georgescu, and obviously it's kind of saying what you would guess, right? It's kind of like pink hat wearing, people in the streets saying, this is not our real president. So we're happy that this was canceled. Yeah.
Feels a little bit like it might have been AstroTurf, just looking at it, maybe USAID funded.
We'll get into that.
Kind of feels that way to me on the surface.
So the primary group is a group called Save Romania Union, which is not USAID connected that I could find. But Lasconi, the sitting president, has direct ties to them. And they have direct financial ties to the EU.
Just to be clear, I think Lasconi is who came in second in the election, not the sitting president.
Right. Yeah. So that's interesting, right? So this was put on by an NGO that's connected to the person who came in second, and a group called Funky Citizens was involved, although they didn't organize the protests. There was media articles that suggested they were involved. They have received USAID money. We'll get into that in a bit, though.
Funky Citizens. I just can't get over that name. It just sounds like maybe a Romanian funk band or something.
They're hip
like
and cool, dude.
They're
hip and cool, and they're in the government, man.
Sick.
Yeah.
We're making the government work for you, man.
Democracy by canceling elections. So next, the Constitutional Court annuls the entire election process, citing the foreign interference that was then highlighted by the president. Right?
Okay, so at first they verified the results after a recount and said, we're all good to go.
Yeah.
And then this evidence comes out and says, actually there was foreign interference, and then they go back and say, whoops, never mind.
Yep.
No election never happened.
Yep. Yeah. And so that's not like 2 days go by, right? December 4th to December 6th. And then they cancel the election.
Wild.
Voting had already begun because remote ballot voting. So they have the Romanian diaspora of Romanians overseas. 48,000 votes are just annulled at that point. Yeah.
And this is for the second round.
This is for the second round, the runoff. There's no publicly available evidence that Georgescu personally orchestrated the influence campaign. He does have a TikTok with a lot of followers. It's just saying his followers are Russian bots, right?
Is there any way to prove that?
Well, you would guess there would be like IP address analysis of some kind, but I don't know if they can get that from TikTok. Can they request it via like a warrant of some kind? But it's like I found the document. It's heavily redacted. I couldn't get it translated because it was all PDF unscannable. But I could have if I would have spent a lot more time on it. But I did not have that time. So basically, on pretty flimsy evidence, the whole thing is canceled at that point. Ioannis, the current president, calls the decision national security matter and extends his term until a new election. Of course, Georgescu goes to the press and he says this is a coup by the current sitting president. Remember, this is Eastern Europe, right? So like a coup is like a thing that happens,
not unheard of.
Keep in mind, 2014, the Maidan Revolution, that was a coup, a street putsch where there was battles in the streets, and thankfully this has not gotten as violent, although you can find relatively recent protests that have gotten quite contentious and violent in the streets of Bucharest.
So after this, we see tens of thousands of people take to the streets, this time demanding that the original election results be reinstated and Ioannis be ejected because they feel like he's now sort of taking control of the government and undoing democracy.
Yeah, and when you find the videos of those protests, it's a lot more. Like it's filling the area, the streets, like the whole square is just completely packed. We don't really know. I mean, it's somewhere between 20 and 50,000 people show up. So that happens. He files a petition at the European Court of Human Rights, and in America that's like mumbo jumbo, like letters to Santa Claus sort of thing. But in Europe,
Dear
that's kind
Santa,
of a big deal, right?
Please make me president.
Because that's kind of why you have an EU Court of Human Rights, right? It's specifically to put a check on your member states from going off the EU charter and having things happen that aren't compatible. Think of it like petitioning the federal government when something really corrupt happens on the state level.
Sure.
Although it technically, in the conservative mindset, the states are sovereign and the federal government's creation of the states. Post Civil War, that relationship changed substantially and has even more so throughout the 20th century. But fundamentally, that's still true that the states are sovereign. Yet, we would guess that a federal court deciding on something would be a final stamp. Now, imagine if you did that and you put it to the Supreme Court and they said, actually, it's inadmissible. There's no imminent risk of irreparable harm in this action. And later determining claims under the articles of free elections, right? Like our guarantee as American citizens to our public, or a fair trial, or expression, or assembly, are manifestly ill-founded or incompatible with the convention, meaning the EU convention that created the EU.
Okay, so this would be like, say there's a contested election for a governor of a state, and they appeal to the federal government and said something is totally corrupt here going on, and the federal government basically just said, nope, we're not going to touch it. Everything is fine here, and you don't actually really have a right to even hear your case at this court level.
Yeah, that's kind of that's pretty much. And I'm not going to say that that's uniquely European. In fact, that happened in Montana not too long ago.
Really?
Yeah, but it happened through a more circuitous route, right? So what happened was the Montana. This was a governor's race in 2012. The AG was running against a guy who used to be a congressman. The AG, the campaign accused him of a campaign finance violation. A month before the election. So like key prime time, right? This is when absentee ballots go out, when most of the election actual votes happen.
This is October surprise stuff.
Yes. And the Montana Supreme Court ordered the governor's campaign that they could not spend any money at that point until there had been a final decision.
Oh, really?
So they completely shut off all communications of the campaign, no grassroots, no commercials, no television, no internet, none of that stuff. And the election got over, and then it got further into the cycle, and they adjudicated it out and discovered that it was a minor infraction. It was an accident. It wasn't a big deal.
But what they did was say, the month before your election, you can no longer spend money.
Yes.
Wild.
Yeah.
So did that get elevated to a federal court?
No. Montana Supreme Court was the last word on it.
Really?
And in typical district courts, will defer to state Supreme Courts in that. So like similar analogy, right? Not the same, but similar. Like where in keep in mind that if you're not from Montana, you might not get the idea that, all right, you might look at the electoral map for president and be like, oh, it's a red state. But our Supreme Court is very liberal. It's one of the most progressive Supreme Courts in the country. So there's definitely a political undertone there for the right wing that's like, okay, you did this for a reason. You didn't have to order us to be quiet for the last month.
And yeah, just to be very, very clear, the Supreme Court was ruling against the Republican candidate.
Yes.
Gotcha. Yeah. Well, I can't imagine why they would do that.
So, fast forward to February, Ioannis resigns ahead of an impeachment vote tied to his extended term and his role in the election with this intel document. Polls showed that he had a below 20%. I saw some that said 15% approval rate.
Wow.
Right. So the whole thing, the extended term, everything just looked way too sketchy. I mean, the Romanian public, the poll around here is so dramatic, right? So you could understand that there would be a lot of people tracking this story, right? It's not nothing. And there's a tremendous, and that embodied itself in an impeachment, and then he resigns before the impeachment can actually go through the process.
So it's not over for Georgescu, though, even though his appeal to the higher court was declined. He did file to run again, did he not?
Yeah, right. So soon after that, in March, he files, and the whole election was meant to be in March. So for the next run. And what happened March 10th this week is the Central Election Board, called the CEB, it rejected his candidacy. You don't get to run for this office. Referencing the Constitutional Court's December 2024 ruling that we mentioned earlier, they argued his campaign benefited from illegal interference, right? The TikTok bots, cyber attacks, undeclared funds, remember that, violating electoral law. There hasn't been any conclusive finding on this stuff. It's just accusations at this point. There's no court process. There's no evidentiary standard where you face your accuser. None of that stuff's happened. This is just on the accusation. And the ban hinges on the court's finding that it compromised fairness through the evidence tying him to Russia, but all of that still remains classified, right? So all that stuff is all blanked out. It wasn't clear to me, and maybe I'm wrong about this, but it isn't even clear to me that the courts got to see the actual unredacted evidence.
Really?
Yeah. So I tried to find and could not.
So this is echoing of 2016 for sure.
Yeah, right.
Or I guess rather 2020 is really what I meant to say, where the election is being so handily contained and constricted by the establishment parties here. Right. A lot of EU forces at play, a lot of interesting intel connections and unsubstantiated evidence of accusations that we won't find out the answers to probably for years, if at all, right? In this case. So now Georgescu has been forbidden from running for this office. Are we seeing any fallout from that on the streets? Are we seeing tens of thousands of people taking to the streets in response to this?
Yes, huge protests since then. In fact, it was actually hard to research a lot of the story because so much of the coverage is on the existing protests about the whole thing and the real standoff they're at as a party. And just imagine this for a moment. Remember all the lawfare against Donald Trump?
Yes.
Right. The attempt to use the January 6th as a pretense to say he was therefore an insurrectionist and therefore was ineligible to run. Imagine if a court decided that, therefore a court did at one point, if I remember right? It actually declared that and then it was overruled by the district court.
Yeah, I think so. I think you're right.
Right. So imagine if that had stuck at the district level and he wasn't able to run. How many protests there'd be? How many outraged MAGA people there would be?
Yeah.
That's what's going on in Romania right now.
That is nuts. So I assume that Lasconi is going to be allowed to run.
Yeah.
And will probably win with a similar margin, or a similar number of votes that she got the previous time, right?
Yeah.
You would think?
Assuming that there
What
isn't
is-
someone else to step up to file and then like to carry his name.
Yeah.
But he's an independent. He doesn't have a party.
Right.
He was part of a party that was considered far right, and he was kicked out of that party for some statements that he said. I wasn't able to get far enough into the statements to really understand why it was so controversial, but it had to do with like leadership at the time of World War II and Romania's participation in the Third Reich, right? So it might have been very edgy, right? I don't know, but he leaves the party and runs as independent and then wins. There's not really anyone to carry his banner because of that, right? You don't have a J.D. Vance to carry Trump's banner, sort of analogy.
Right. It would almost be as if this happened to Trump in 2016 before he had developed the following, the MAGA following, and sort of like, built the Republican Party around himself. At this point, he's sort of just floating free in the world. He's got a lot of support. Clearly, he's got tens of thousands of people in the streets marching on his behalf, but no infrastructure, no apparatus to help his ideology move forward in this election.
Correct.
So what happens to that? I mean, to me, this seems like playing with fire. You've got a ton of people in the streets who are outraged, rightfully so. It seems like a lot of foul play here. I mean, are they on the verge of, violence? What's going to happen?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen some stuff that was like, ooh, yeah. I mean, it looks like very Black Lives Matter type Antifa like stuff.
But populists in the street saying our views, our voices are not being heard here.
Yes.
We demand representation.
Yeah, and that's the funny thing. You'll find Sky News stuff calling these protesters anti-democratic. I was like, wait, well, which protesters are we talking about? What, these are George Gascu? What? I mean,
Yes,
but that itself shows you the subtle switch in language that they use specifically to cast the other side out of political discourse, right? And remember the card play of redefining democracy and support for democracy as support for institutions.
Right. It's like that video that we saw where we heard the media saying dangerous to democracy, referring to democracy over and over, but they replaced it with bureaucracy. Right.
Yes.
It all makes more sense when you replace democracy with bureaucracy.
Yes.
And I mean that goes back to something that we mentioned at the beginning, which is what was the USAID influence in this country, and was there any influence around this particular election?
Yeah, so the direct ties I wasn't able to find. There are some great Mike Benz videos on this I recommend, but we have a couple groups that have solid connections to USAID and then solid connections to like the NATO EU project. And keep in mind that there's in the history of this there's like, if you're an Atlanticist, right, your goal is to create an American NATO, an American EU security and economic zone so that you can control this, isolate Russia, isolate other actors, and have a power base there. From independence in the early 1990s to 2007, about $600 million was spent from USAID on kind of creating the civil society institutions that now operate in Romania to this day, with the exception, there's some other ones too that got founded afterwards.
So what kind of organizations would that include? Media, things of that nature?
Think tanks. Think of all the stuff that we've covered when it came to USAID and what Doge has been working on. When we undercovered like the Syria Verify Psi thing, these are all like those institutions for total information control in a country so that you can direct where it's going. When we talked about 9 out of 10 media outlets in Ukraine were funded by USAID, and that's why there's a mono narrative out of Ukraine about how to understand the Maidan coup, how to understand Yanukovych and all of that history. Well, that's why, right? I mean, because these dollars come with strings attached to carry a particular narrative that these people who are acting probably themselves individually think is a good idea, right? They think EU, bureaucracy control over Romania is probably the net good for all these reasons, right? And we could dive into the reasons. And then NATO membership and the Ukraine war being a net good because Russia is a terrible, wants to reestablish the USSR and conquer all of Europe again, and et cetera, right? So you have these groups like Logs Group Die Initiatives Sociale, $25,000 in 2021, $20,000 for 2023. They do like scholarship programs focused on disadvantaged groups and refugee programs. So one of the issues that kind of sits in the background is the refugee question, like Ukrainian refugees, how many should we take in? What do those look like? And then migrants from the global south. All those things all sit there. There's substantial amounts of investments in that area. This is just one of the groups.
What about those funky citizens?
Yeah, right. So they were funded in as recently as 2023 with $95,000. Keep in mind that that's not a trivial amount of money for democracy and human rights projects, including online censorship monitoring.
There it is.
Yep.
There it is.
So actively engage in civic engagement. In fact, I wanted to show you their website. This is their English. This is the only page on the website that actually has much English in it. But just listen when you hear this for the euphemism, right? That we understand from. Ooh, got some light on me now. Yeah. Look at me. Yeah. Funky Citizens is the meeting place for citizens who don't limit themselves to the status quo, but understand their role in democracy, which is why they work their civic muscle and often take part in decision-making process. Our strongest weapons are smart technology initiatives, data, and communication advocacy, and civic education, a cross-cutting pillar in everything we do. And you got the team here. Right. So, bunch of young people.
Very young people.
Yeah.
Funky Citizens,
right? So, is this all to be blamed on? Don't straw man me here. I'm not saying that this was all their operation, right? I think the USAID fingerprints were more easily demonstrated and heavily everywhere in Ukraine, right? Because you got, Victoria Nuland on video handing out food to protesters, and John McCain going there to talk to the Azov battalion about how great a work they're doing.
Right. But how much of that is because Ukraine is such a battleground, no pun intended, but I mean really like an important state geopolitically. Romania is sort of like, while it's in the region, it's not as like, at least perceived to me and maybe other people involved in this is as important, right? It's just sort of this satellite, former Soviet bloc kind of place that's kind of it's just not as significant, is it?
Well, there's intuitiveness there, right? I mean, Romania's been part of NATO for longer, right? It wasn't a red line for Russia to the degree that Ukraine was. That's why it's more controversial. That's why they probably required more. We overthrew the government of Ukraine in 2014 and 2004, right? Like this is, and they have their corruption problems, but not the same kind of corruption problems that Ukraine had on the scale where they were able to get into the EU and to NATO and all that kind of stuff. Much earlier.
Do you think that the pro-EU powers saw this coming in Romania, this populist uprising, or was this maybe more of a surprise to them?
I don't think so at this point. I mean, I don't think anyone's shocked when a populist figure is coming up. I mean, after Marie Le Pen and the AfD and everything that's in Hungary and all these countries.
It's like whack-a-mole for them right now. They're just like trying to battle all these populist uprisings.
Right. So there's also some media investments, right? So the Romanian Press Club Center for Independent Journalism, and getting back, and I will return to the strategic question you asked. That's an important one, but I do want to make sure I don't miss this. They received USAID funding for media development. So media control there has their pillar, right, in the information control space. And there's dozens of others to get into, but I did follow this interesting line of a Mike Benz theory on for-profit LNG sources. So he says that USAID was involved in that. Technically, that would be illegal, but I'm not putting past anything for being illegal from these guys. I just couldn't find any supporting sources. But that said, there is substantial U.S. private sector investment in Romanian gas.
I see.
From like places like ExxonMobil, major gas producers that you would not be surprised. So natural gas as a major energy source for Europe, this is an important place. So if what he's doing is, as they see it, aggressively neutral towards Russia, that's like when you look at the opposition, you try to find their most charitable take sometimes, right? Because you're like, some of these takes are just so bizarre, like he's pro-Putin, things like that. Like, And he has said things like Putin was a great leader, but you could say Pol Pot was a great leader. Like you could say lots of people are great leaders, and without saying that, therefore I love him.
David, that quote's going to get taken out of context now. You're going to get Daryl Cooper.
Well, he did fight a substantial guerrilla war against major powers and won. Okay, so you can't take it. He also murdered millions of people. I don't think he's a bad guy.
Doesn't matter that you qualify it. You just got Daryl Cooper. Nice job.
But that's, Daryl Cooper me, I guess.
You'll make it on Rogan if that happens.
The strategic reason. Okay, so why is there so much interest there? I think that's a really good question. So Romania is host to the largest naval base under construction in NATO. And it will be the largest when it's done, right? 50% larger than the Ramstein base in Germany, which was the largest base. So, and this is right on the Black Sea. So think of Crimea. I don't have a map up, but here's an article about it. Romania to host largest NATO base in Europe. The new base will give Romania an increased role in NATO security architecture and a greater position of strength in the Black Sea, which is militarily dominated by Russia since Crimea. That's an important part there, right? Because Russia's access to the Black Sea is largely dependent on that. It will be able to host 10,000 soldiers and civilians by 2023. 10,000. That's a lot of people.
So it does have strategic importance to NATO.
Additionally, for the Ukraine war, most of the weapons from the global south, purchased to the global south and run up through that direction, is through the Black Sea. We don't necessarily move even American weapons across Europe to do it because it's slower and less efficient and all that kind of stuff. You can use railroads and stuff like that, but the waterways is a substantial way to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So this is a peripheral NATO play to ostensibly just put more pressure on Russia.
Yeah, and Georgescu opposes the base and opposes arms movements to Ukraine.
It's all making sense now,
right?
It's all making
right.
sense.
And think about it too. Like if we have the economic treaty, the USMCA after Trump with Canada, and there was a major Chinese base in Canada. And they were like, we're going to put an even larger base in, right, into America, and how people in America would react to that even larger base full of foreign troops on your soil.
Or even in an adjacent country.
Yeah. You would be kind of like, I don't know if I like this, right? It goes to that old Ron Paul video, right?
Yeah.
Chinese troops in Texas.
That's right. I couldn't help but think of that when we had Scott Horton talking about, the equivalent narrative going on with Russia, Ukraine. Mm-hmm. Totally makes sense.
And trying to drive the strategic empathy here of of understanding the way Georgescu supporters would understand this phenomena. And while it seems like the press is just like, well, he's pro-Putin. And what else do they say about him? They say, what did I wrote down? Well, one, he's a fascist, of course. Like that's almost classic.
I mean, I think that's just a given. Yeah. With anyone who doesn't support the mainstream narrative, you're a fascist.
Yeah, right. And so, if you were a closet fascist, you wouldn't say, "Oh, I'm a huge Nazi guy," right? But I mean, the other characteristics like far right figure, pro Putin, pro Russian, conspiracy theorist.
I like him already.
Right. What he calls himself is anti woke. He's like a Christian. He emphasizes his Christianity. And that's kind of like the basis of his opposition to wokeness. Politically incorrect, anti-globalist, pro-Romanian, right? All right, so he's not pro-EU, he's pro-Romanian. Is that the fascist position?
He's Romania first.
Right.
It makes sense.
Yeah, he's a MAGA-like figure.
He is. The parallels are really uncanny. That's very interesting. But it's the military-based thing that really drives it home for me. Mm-hmm. With NATO's interest in that, and its strategic location in the world, that makes all the sense in the world why they would want to really put the clamps on this election, get him out of the way. And it seems like that's easier for them to do in Romania than it would be for them to do in the United States, mm-hmm. just because of the founding of our country and the ideals that we have and the protections that we have for integrity around some of these things. It seems like it would be harder here than there.
Oh, for sure. I mean, trying to that empathy for it. After the fall of the USSR, there's like a common EU push to like, okay, we're going to be liberal now, and we're going to create all this trade, and we're going to get prosperity into these areas, and that's large. That's what happened. It was largely successful in many ways, right? In a more common European market means more imports and exports, more abundance of resources and goods and specialization. The flywheel of trade is that specialization that allows you to produce one thing and trade it for another.
Yeah.
But Romania also has poverty problems and long-term corruption problems it has never solved that do undermine that. But it's a very Christian country too. And when you see the USAID putting tremendous resources into these countries, George Soros-like ways that create a tremendous amount of combativeness in the name of human rights and democracy, it's understandable that there's this ground swelling of pushback.
Yeah.
And in fact, in the best interview from Georgescu, and I do recommend people go watch it, is Sean Ryan actually interviewed him last year, or not long ago, like right after the election cancellation. Not the election, not when he was banned from it, but when everything got canceled. So last December. And it's a good, and what he says, he wants to ban the George Soros network from Romania. That the war in Ukraine is not his business. And he's very critical of legacy media. And when you watch like his interviews with Sky News and BBC and stuff like that, they ask the most ridiculous questions. So he spends the whole time being like, no, I'm not a Nazi. Like that's the only thing that ever happens. I never hear what he's for on anything, right? So he's still a bit of a mysterious figure for me because I don't speak Romanian.
Well, but that's also
you're
their
trying
MO.
to find it, right?
That's their MO. I mean, you heard, there was an interview with a representative of AFD. I believe it was on one of those networks, and it was all of that. And she actually called it out. She was like, "You just want me to sit here and defend myself instead of talking about what we're for. You know, you want to label me as a Nazi and have me spend 7 minutes defending myself. That's not the way we're going to do this.
Right.
That's the MO. The sad part that you mentioned, an interesting part, I would say as well, speaking of a Christian nation, Romania being one, Russia is also a very Christian nation, which I wonder if that has played a part in the antagonism between this sort of EU coalition and Russia as well. Like, and to that point, also, Russia has wanted to be a part of European trade and global trade and engage in the world in that way, and they've been prohibited from doing so for some reason by the powers that be. Many American presidents have gone to Russia and tried to strike deals and gone back and talked to their people, and their people have said, no, actually, we can't do that.
Right.
Which is really strange to me. Like, what are those forces that want to alienate and antagonize a country when that country actively wants to be for peace and trade and engage in the world?
Well, and you might there's possible that I'm missing something. I'm a long ways from Germany and Romania, right? I'm just trying to engage in the best faith way I can to understand what these people are saying about each other and about themselves. And what I can see is a story closer to than that. Then they're all closet Hitler people, and that's really what's happening. Like that's just, especially because they've overplayed their hands in America to such a degree.
Yes,
you know what I mean. Like I have my qualms. We just did a podcast on it. It came out a little late, but no big deal on some of my criticisms of Trump. But Hitler, like, what are we doing here? Like, what do we? And that's all obviously fake because they all just sit next to him and do the photo ops right after he wins the election, anyways.
Exactly.
All of this stuff. I mean, it seems like to me to be just the media play to on behalf of the powers of the EU and NATO interest groups.
Yep.
So if that's true, you're right. There's like a civilizational, like there's an identitarian underlay here, right? Of secularists, neoliberal, I think might be the right word, vision of NATO and the EU, where you have the more traditionalist, communitarian, nationalist impulses of Russia, Hungary, Romania, and that's like the conflict that kind of undersets everything. And no one ever talks about that conflict. They just talk about each other with these like super dramatic terms of, well, you're a globalist, well, you're a fascist, and that's all that really happens, right?
Well, and by just doing the labeling and the name calling, you're avoiding actually having the real conversation around this is a civilizational argument, a battle that is going on right now for what direction is humanity going generally, right? And I'm frankly glad to see that there are people on the other side of it, like that and that the people of these countries who are showing up in the streets in support of a figure like Georgescu do see it as well. I mean, and it seems like a lot of people in a lot of countries who talk about the populist uprisings in Germany and Italy and everywhere in Europe, this isn't a one-sided movement. There is a lot of resistance to this globalist predisposition for the world to be going that direction. It's not just a one-way street. There is a really fundamental battle going on.
Right. And we did that immigration monologue where we pointed to all these like strange coincidences that happen in all these countries and how, it isn't. I don't think it's a forced meta narrative on on what's going on in the world, like from the largest picture, from the highest point of view, to say that what we really face is a moment of people facing things on the ground that they want solutions to, being told by the bureaucracy that it is undemocratic for them to participate in the process. and by doing so, by saying, no, we have a national identity. We care about who we are. And if, and it's like, it happened on the Joe Rogan podcast, actually, with Daryl Cooper, where it's like, it would be a tragedy if Ireland was no longer Irish, right?
Yeah.
That sentiment makes a lot of sense to a lot of people, right?
Which he did say they're on track to be no longer majority Irish by like 2070 or something like that.
Right.
Which is true. And I think a lot of people out in their own respective countries who have pride in their nationality and their culture are seeing that trend and pushing back against it. But I wonder if these populations are systematically prohibited from participating in the process of democracy, being told they're anti-democratic for wanting to do so, what is the next avenue for them to explore in order to retain their national sovereignty, their culture? I mean, to me, it looks like a one-way street to some sort of really violent and terrible situation.
Yeah, it depends on the details on the ground. And I just don't know enough about Romania to give any prescriptions. But I would guess that the description is in lieu of the Cold War, that is democracy, right? Where you go to battle with ideas with the other side, go to battle rhetorically, where you go to battle in the media and the press and on the ground, on the doorstep, in the mail. Rather than doing that, the only other battle to have is with guns and
in the streets
and fists, right?
Yeah.
So like that would also be terrible, but it's also like, how else do you do that? Like from the American ear, what we hear is when governments have become so repugnant, so abusive of the natural rights of the people to decide for themselves who their government should be, it is the duty of conscious individuals to stand up and do something about that.
Yes.
Right. And I wouldn't be surprised if it goes that direction. And at the end of the day, it's going to be the elite's fault for this.
For sure. Well,
Right?
I wonder if it's not the elite's objective for it to come to that point. Because at that point, it's like, okay, it's open season. And we can bring tanks and troops into the streets, and we can have military law and order and government. And now the people's rights are fully squashed, especially if they don't have the ability to defend themselves, which a lot of these countries don't because they don't have a Second Amendment. And they don't have a robust culture of arming themselves and defending themselves, a way to defend themselves against a tyrannical government.
Yeah. Yeah. We're getting really American with it now, judging the whole world on that. But
Hell yeah, brother.
yeah, hell yeah, brother. But yeah, you're right. You're absolutely right. And it's, there's few things that I will prescribe value to, but the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, those sorts of things, those American institutions are critical for protecting liberty. And it is a shame, watching this happen in a place like Romania, where it didn't have to be this way. They could have let it go along. You do what you can to constrain the power of the president, and you fight the battle out in the parliament, and you do that kind of work. That would be the I'm a good faith actor world. But they're not. They're not. They're saying we're going to violate all the rules, all the norms, and just say screw your election. And then on top of that, not to make them rerun, but also to ban them. That's just so many bridges too far.
For sure.
At that point.
For sure.
And I watched some great videos, and I actually wanted to play them, but I failed to grab them. Apologies. Of some interviews. Sky News did some interviews with some regular people on the street. And it's funny because they're like looking for somebody who's critical for Georgescu, and they couldn't find him. And every person's just like, oh yeah, I'm really worried about democracy. And they're like, oh yeah. And then they're like, and a lot of these are Romanians speaking in English, and they're like, yeah, they canceled our election. That's undemocratic. Like there's just, you could see the battle for what does the word democracy mean play out in real time.
Yes.
Yeah.
It means something very different to the bureaucracy than it does to the people. Very true.
Right.
And for people in America, I would say, who are critical of the Second Amendment, which probably is not a large proportion of our listeners, but to just, to like kind of have this bit of the narrative spelled out a little bit more. For anybody that says that the Second Amendment is for hunting or whatever, or why do we have to have the Second Amendment? We have so many, gun deaths in this country, whatever the argument is. Yeah. What's going on in Romania is exactly why you have to have this. If this goes further, if the people are oppressed and completely removed from their democratic process, that's what it's for. Mm-hmm. That's what it's for. So when people ask you, why should we have it? This is it.
Yeah.
This is it.
Yeah. And just because this is Eastern Europe doesn't mean it can't happen here. And that is a real truth. We see it all the time, right? Mm-hmm. Suppression of speech, the Khalil story that we covered earlier this week. There's just so much. I mean, it is easy to just say, well, America's the exception to that rule. All right. And it is, but we're not.
But, well,
we're just human. This is a human thing. This is a power thing. This is the nature of having a monopoly on power.
Yes.
The ultimate libertarian criticism is like, this is what you get when you get when you have these things. When you subject things to democracy, the powerful will use that and weaponize that in order to maintain their power.
Right.
And even having a court that's in charge of your elections, like that itself is wild to me.
Yeah.
Because it's at least in the American experience, it's typically it's typically understood to be a civil society function that then becomes a political function rather than a managed court phenomena, right? Mm-hmm. Because courts themselves are typically undemocratic by nature. So,
for sure.
Yeah,
absolutely. As we know in Montana. For sure.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Very interesting stuff. Any final thoughts, David?
No, I really appreciate the talk. I mean, I find this story to be interesting. We're going to keep monitoring it. We'll keep covering it as updates come along, and we can hopefully see this shake out in as positive a way as possible. But like you said, it's a rough go. We don't know where it's going to go from here, so it's worth keeping your eye on, especially given the overall dynamic. Right? I mean, we got this week Ukraine agreed to a ceasefire with security guarantees, and Russia said no ceasefire, but we're open to one if there's long-term solutions to our security questions.
Right. I believe the narrative from the Russians is this is just a temporary timeout for Ukrainian troops to take a breather and probably mount another offensive or defensive.
Right.
They don't see it as a lasting deal that is going to create long-term peace.
Yeah, and both sides are saying that about each other. But I mean, what's the better case there is obvious that there is a there's more need for that on the Ukrainian side because they have less people. Like, that's just the math. Yeah. But also, like, it's Zelensky who's going around saying in the Oval Office, yeah, but what kind of ceasefire, JD? Right. The one that's going to give me nuclear weapons or not, right? Or the one's going to guarantee me NATO membership or not, because that's not a real ceasefire, right? That's not a real peace. And the same thing Russia's saying, exactly the same. That's the debate, and you got to get those people to the table. Yeah. So if that happens, some of those things go away, but there's still the long-term stuff. They still want to build that base regardless of what happens in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. Specifically for projecting power against Russia. How's Russia going to interpret this? They have access to the internet. They can see that these things are happening, right? They're going to be saying, well, obviously NATO's not giving up on their war against us. Even if Ukraine stops and we get everything we want, these guarantees are only a pit stop on the larger war that they want to have. So,
and completely subject to in some senses, the president, whoever the president of the U.S. is, or whoever's leading NATO, right? Mm-hmm. After Trump, if it's not, someone with a generally anti-NATO expansionist worldview, it could just start right back up.
Right. And that's the tragedy of it. And
which actually raises one final question before we do wrap up. Do you think that we will see Trump inject himself into this conversation of what's going on in Romania?
Ooh, that's a great question. And it has been more of an internet story, right? There's been mainstream stuff in Europe, but I haven't seen much mainstream stuff at all in the U.S. about this. That's typical American bias, maybe, but it also could be, and like he's more responsive to American press, of course. Mm-hmm.
He's got his hands full with a lot of other things going on in the U.S. right now, a lot of turmoil here. So
we have seen Elon engage in it. Like he's very specifically, he's posted on X about it.
Co-president Elon?
Co-president, yeah. Tech support, depends on your model. Gilded Age dictator of America.
Grand oligarch.
Yeah, right. So depending on your model here, they already have. But I would suggest that, might percolate below the surface before it blows up again, and maybe he does. You would think, especially J.D. Vance goes to Europe and he has this big speech about why Europe isn't actually liberal, because of censorship and all this stuff. They should be more like America like that. And maybe our State Department should be orientated towards encouraging that rather than encouraging them to overthrow their elections and suppress minority voices in their countries.
Yeah.
This is the best case of it now, right? I mean, it's not Marie Le Pen, AFD. I haven't checked in with them for a while, but, all of those stories, that's like underlaying everything that's happening right now in the global dynamic and what is the strategic interest of America and Romania, right? And to the degree that there isn't any, right?
Other than that huge military base.
Yeah, right. Well, that's not a strategic. That's in pursuit. That should be in pursuit of a strategic interest, right? We built bases where we have Americans to protect and like things that are actually ours. And that goes to the other topic, which we might dive into a little bit of the skiff. What does it mean to American? What does it mean to have an interest in another country? What do these identity questions mean when it comes to our politics and our relationship to government? We'll be getting into that into the skiff, and if you're not a member, you should sign up to be a member so that you can get access to that information and all that great analysis.
Absolutely, and even if you're not a member, we encourage you to join our Discord server. We have a lot of great conversations in there, some spicy conversations as of late.
Hell yeah.
Good debates, as always, what we encourage, and we would love to have you be a part of them. So check the link in the description below this video and in the show notes if you're watching on Spotify or Apple. Once again, for my friend David Rand, for the rest of the team here at Human Reaction, I'm Joe Sheehan. We will see you in the next one. Thank you. Thanks for tuning in to Human Reaction. Please be sure to like, follow, subscribe, and give us a review on your podcast platform of choice. And if you want to become a member and support the show financially, check out humanreactionpod.com.